Well, hello, and welcome to the Unit 2, Lecture 2. I hope you have enjoyed Unit 2 so far. You're entering into a very important part of U.S. history, the 20th century, defined even by some as the American century. So I hope you're finding all the material interesting. What I want to do in this short lecture is talk about three particular elements related to World War I. Try to make it a little more relevant to things that have been going on over the past few years that most of us have lived through. The first point I'd like to make is looking at how World War I began. I hope you read that carefully, that you looked into sort of the comedy of errors that really resulted in this great tragedy known as World War I. At the time, of course, it was the Great War. It would have been one of the largest wars ever fought in world history. By far, some of the largest numbers of dead, individuals killed during that war, an absolutely horrific war. But basically, looking at how the war began, what you have is a province, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Austria had annexed that particular region, Austria-Hungary. Archduke Ferdinand was in Sarajevo to basically on a political mission to tour the city, to try and spread goodwill and such. And Serbia, an independent nation state, had these grand visions that at one point Serbia would become a dominant force in the Balkans, in that particular region. And a terrorist group by the name of the Black Hand plotted to assassinate the Archduke Ferdinand. Now, I won't get into all of the details, but in the end, the assassination, as you know, was successful, and it resulted, of course, in the Archduke and his wife's death, and this, of course, will lead to World War I. But what I'd like to highlight, how could that particular incident set off a powder keg that would result in this major war? And when you look at it, you see some themes that are relevant to today. Because again, what you have is a Serbian-backed, a Serbian-sponsored terrorist group that commits an act of terrorism against Austria-Hungary through this assassination. Austria-Hungary ties the nation-state to the terrorist group, to the Black Hand, and will then punish Serbia by basically demanding that it be annexed and become a part of Austria-Hungary for all intent and purposes. And so Russia will then back Serbia and its sovereignty, which then unleashes a chain of events that will bring about World War I. By Russia and Austria-Hungary going to war, Germany was committed to support Austria-Hungary and then declare war on Russia. France then has to protect Russia, and then when Belgian neutrality is basically violated with the German invasion of France through Belgium, then England enters the war as part of the Allies. But when Austria-Hungary takes the position that Serbia was indirectly responsible for this assassination, as it, in essence, supplied the terrorists with their weapons and such, and also, indirectly backed this assassination, what you're seeing is the notion that terrorist groups sponsored by the nation state will find that not only are they responsible for their actions, but so too is the nation state that backs their particular action. And what we call this today is the Bush Doctrine, the notion that nation states will be held accountable for the acts of any terrorist groups that operate from their borders or are supplied by the nation state. In essence, this is what justified the invasion of Afghanistan, and it is also then what justified the invasion of Iraq. So it's kind of interesting that the position that Austria-Hungary took in 1914 was in many ways very similar to a policy that for the most part still governs U.S. foreign policy. Now, as for the war itself, horrific war, absolutely horrific. It devolved into trench warfare. The technology of the age was not, or was rather surpassed, the tactics of the time. And what I mean by this is simply, just as we saw in the American Civil War, which we generally mythologize and sort of see as linear tactics being embraced, where men stand shoulder to shoulder, level their guns, and fire a volley at a similarly aligned group of men who all fall dead. That's not entirely accurate. it became increasingly obvious during the Civil War that those tactics did not work. And so you start to see trench warfare developing during the American Civil War. Well, this is in many ways foreshadowing what's going to come in World War I, except the trenches are much more extensive, they're much more advanced, and what you see is simply, especially on the Western Front, a devolution into a stagnant form of warfare where groups of men jump over the trenches, run across no man's land, get mowed down by machine guns and the use of gas weapons and explosions and all of this, and the casualty rate is incredibly high. And so it's interesting that we see that this style of warfare was foreshadowed in the American Civil War, most definitely. But more recently, what you saw with Gulf War I, for those of you who remember, back in the early 90s, back in 1991, when the United States became involved with an invasion of Iraq the first time, Saddam Hussein, who had been involved throughout the 1980s in a war with Iran, embraced those very same tactics he had used against Iran, which was trench warfare, very similar to World War I. And so he lined his troops along the border, he dug trenches, he dug fortifications, and the United States did what World War II taught military officers. You simply bypass those fortifications. You flank them. You use blitzkrieg tactics to rip through the enemy's lines and then surround them and force them to surrender. And so, again, what we see unfolding in World War I not only has a relationship to the American Civil War, but also kind of reflects Saddam Hussein's mentality in 1991 when he tried to stand up to the United States and its allies. Finally, point 3. Look at what brought America into World War I. The German decision to launch unrestricted use of submarine warfare in the Atlantic. Germany had no chance of defeating the British surface fleet. Through most of the war, the German surface fleet, battleships, destroyers, and such, they were tied to their ports. They couldn't really break free and enforce an embargo, basically, on England. They couldn't enforce any way of preventing England from getting its supplies. So they used submarines, which easily snuck between, underneath the ships, the British fleet, and then would go sink merchant ships. However, the United States embraced a position that this was a violation of international law, which dictated that an unarmed merchant ship had to be warned before it was going to be sunk. And of course, the strength of the submarine is that it has secrecy on its side. In fact, if an enemy vessel found a sub, they're very weak. They could easily have been sunk. So the German submarines had no way of warning these unarmed ships that they were about to be sunk. And the United States took a position, especially after the sinking of the Lusitania, that the Germans' use of such tactics on the high seas was in violation of international law, and it would bring the United States into the war. And that's exactly what it did. But now, look back 100 years earlier, in 1812, when the United States took the same position in relation to to England, and went to war with England in 1812, the War of 1812, as England had tried to impose a similar blockade on the continent of Europe as it was fighting France. And so this violation of international law brought about the War of 1812 with England. The same principles were in play 100 years later when the United States went to war with Germany. I hope this makes some interesting connections for you, and continue to enjoy Unit 2. Take care.